Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here on what is a rainy, kind of crummy night in Minnesota with a few thunder boomers and some lightning in the background. So if I run for the basement, you know why. um, so tonight we're going to talk about communication. I'm so glad that you're back so that we can take a look at part 5 of our Legacy Giving the Basics time together. And you know that I'm Brenda Moore, and you know that I find my joy in equipping ministry leaders with philanthropy's best practices. So if you're with me live, feel free to use the chat box. And anytime you have questions, feel free to type them in. And I'll try to look over every now and then and catch them. And we'll certainly take some time at the end in order to answer some of those questions. So communication, let's take a look at something that Scripture has to say about communication. And this is a passage out of Mark where we learn that we are to go into all the world and proclaim the gospel to the whole creation. I love the word proclaim. That's a whole different level of communication, isn't it? When we proclaim and are bold to speak about God's love for us and about God's love for the whole creation. And as we think about this communication theme tonight, I am hoping that we will think about all of the different ways that we proclaim. For many of us, our ability to proclaim might be limited a bit by some of our discomfort with having the right words in order to proclaim God to the whole world. But for many of us, we understand that proclamation is a lot more than words, isn't it? It's our actions, perhaps more so than our words. And so as we think about proclaiming and communicating God's love to the world, we can think about how our legacy gifts become a part of our proclamation by sharing our generosity, by including ministries in our estate plans. We have yet one more way to proclaim God to the world through our service, through our generosity, through our ministries, who do God's work and serve as Jesus' hands and feet to the world day in and day out. So as we think about communication tonight, let's think about proclaiming and taking seriously our charge to go into all the world, even if it's simply by talking about legacy giving in some new ways and using technology and tools and articles and all kinds of ways of inviting people to join in ministry through their legacy gifts. So you are familiar by now with our framework for legacy giving, and it's hard to believe that we're already on this communication step. We're at our second to the last webinar here in our work with the Legacy Giving Framework. And hopefully you haven't wasted any time at all in being able to implement some of the previous steps that we've talked about. Our agenda for tonight, again, 3 parts. We're going to primarily look at communication steps and tools, and 2 specific things. We're going to talk about promotion planning, and then also about introducing advisors to this work that we're doing. We'll spend a little time at the end looking at some pitfalls that we want to be sure to avoid, and then I'll challenge you with some next steps. And the first thing I'm going to do is torment you with this. I believe it's a cherry pie. I suppose it could be another sort of berry, but if it's cherry, it's one of my favorites. And I'm using this pie as an illustration to help you understand one important concept before we dive into some details. And that is that despite all of our best attempts with the education steps that we take, despite all of our steps that we take in the gifts phase of our work together, there are always going to be donors who choose to be anonymous and want to go down the anonymous path in order to establish their legacy gifts plans. And even in some of those long-standing, very professional plan giving shops, for example, in many universities and colleges, typically half of all bequests and other gifts at death remain unknown to the institution until the time of the donor's death. And so it's important for us, as we think about our communication, to remember that we are providing information and encouragement and material to people whose gifts we will never know about. We're providing it to every single donor, those who are insiders and some who are outsider organizations, those who engage in your legacy giving leaders and who engage legacy giving leaders in the process, and those who are going to rely completely on professional advisors in this process. So the pie is here to help us remember that despite all of our best efforts, there are still plenty of people out there who we need to be communicating to who we don't even know, because half of them are going to do something for us. And they'll surprise us. That's the beautiful part about this. We need to keep telling the story, sharing information, making sure that we've got professional advisors around the table, helping people make these plans, because we just can't be confident that we're talking with everybody who wants to talk with us about this. So communication strategies, promotion strategies are really important. Let's start with step 1 in this communication phase, and we're going to focus on promotion planning at this point. And we're going to spend quite a bit of our time just on developing a solid year-round promotion plan. We'll spend a few minutes on what it means to be working on a legacy giving brochure. And then we'll also take a look at some other content that you can plan to include on your website and through some other channels. So as we do our promotion planning and think about a year-round plan, we're really going to focus on these classic questions that we want to answer in order to chart a good course. The who, what, why, when, where, how of promotion. And the first thing we're going to take a look at is why. Why do we have a promotion plan? And of course, I'm immediately reminded of Lewis Carroll's words from the Cheshire Cat that remind us if we don't know where we're going, any road will get us there. We need a roadmap. We need to have a plan. And especially in the communication world of our ministry organizations, there is, in my experience, a lot of competition for the real estate, for messaging. There are so many things to communicate. And ultimately, fewer people typically in small ministry organizations who manage that communication. And if those of us who are doing legacy giving aren't really intentional about trying to get a piece of the real estate so that we can be sure to communicate our messages, then the people who are used to using that space, the people who are accustomed to having the prime spot on the website or that place in the worship folder are not going to leave room for us just by chance. We've got to be very intentional and proactive in order to be sure that we've got the places, the spaces, the channels to be able to share our messages about legacy giving. That's the why. How about the who? Who are we promoting to anyway? And we've talked about many of these folks as we've looked at identifying our gift prospects, but I just want to remind us about the people we're promoting to. And I actually start with current legacy giving donors. And you might wonder, well, why are we concerned about sharing various messages with people who have already told us that we're in their plans? We haven't really talked about this before in previous sessions, so I wanted to bring it up tonight. And that is that not only are your current donors your best legacy giving prospects, but your best legacy giving prospects are people who have already made a legacy gift plan. I've seen this over and over again, where a person might make their first plan through their will. Let's just say, for example, somebody included your ministry in their will any number of years ago. And then they get to a certain stage in life and they have different concerns or maybe different opportunities. And perhaps they decide that now is a good time for them to do something like, let's say, a charitable gift annuity, or something that provides them with some additional income. Or maybe they're in a position now where they don't really need their IRA income or their required minimum distributions anymore. And now they feel comfortable making a current gift, perhaps also including you as a beneficiary of that plan. It's not uncommon at all in plan giving to see people with multiple gift plans using multiple assets or bringing some assets into current gifts in order to participate in the life of the ministry. So your current legacy giving donors are still some of your best prospects. We've talked about this list of who's before, the loyal contributors. We know that they're the best prospects, also people with no heirs. So we're communicating and promoting to some very specific, more likely people. But in the scheme of things, we're also communicating with everyone, because ultimately we want to plant the seed and create messages already in somebody's mind, even long before they might put this plan in place. So when the time is right, so when there's that triggering event in their life, they are able to put a plan in place. So as we think about who, we are working with the target audiences or identifying our target audiences for our legacy giving messaging. And then let's ask the question, where? I'm a firm believer, as you probably know by now, in not reinventing any wheels, in using your existing communication channels to encourage legacy giving. It should be rare that you would need to create a wholly separate vehicle or a wholly separate channel just for legacy giving. And probably the one biggest exception is a brochure. And other than that, all you need to do is look to the rest of your everyday channels in order to find the perfect place to communicate your message. And so you can see the list here. I think more and more there's a way of doing these messages both in very general approaches to things like email and print, and then some very specific and targeted lists that can be used as well. And so whether it is something that's only annual, like an annual report where you've got the chance to perhaps promote and report, or whether it's something like an email where you've got a chance to just do a quick blast, there are all of these existing channels that you should simply take advantage of. And I would also add, particularly for those in communities that worship, or and whether that is an actual congregation or whether it is a nursing residence that has worship services, we can't be afraid of using that worship experience and the time around it to promote as well. We know that there are all kinds of ways that we can connect faith and scripture to some of the messages that we want to share, to some of the stories we have to tell. So don't be afraid of using the worship service as a way to promote this as well, particularly if you can weave in testimonials and temple talks and things like that. So use those existing communication channels. Don't feel like you have to make up something completely new. And then what is it that we're going to be promoting? We need to identify next the promotion strategies that are best suited to those target audiences. And there are so many different ways that we can promote, and so many strategies that we can use. What I've done is put an asterisk beside some of the strategies here that I really consider to be the minimal things that organizations need to do in order to promote their legacy giving program. And in fact, these minimal things also tend to be the pieces that get the highest response rates. There's evidence from those who are in the marketing profession or for plan giving that these very specific, ultra simple approaches become the best in terms, or receive the highest responses from the people who view them. And so I also want to emphasize simplicity in all of this. The items that have the asterisks are going to be the simplest to implement and roll out if you're just getting started. Some of these other ideas in terms of story development, certain kinds of presentations, those can be more complicated and could potentially be strategies that you use further into your legacy giving program. But when we get to some content items in a few minutes, we'll look specifically at some of these pieces, and they are so easy to just pull into your website, pull into your print, pull into your email, and use on a very regular basis. And then when, how often is the question. So promoting your legacy giving program doesn't need to be complicated, but it does need to be consistent and frequent. You've got to give people regular exposures. And what happens, I think, too often in the life of ministry organizations is that we work at legacy giving in kind of fits and starts, and we might be on a good roll with lots of solid messaging, and then we kind of fall to the wayside because, especially if we're engaging volunteers and don't necessarily have staff support, depending on who's involved, we can lose some traction and we can lose some exposure opportunity. And so there are a few ways of thinking about when as it relates to different kinds of strategies. I personally think that something, for example, like the Have You Remembered ad that I'm going to show you is something that should have at minimum a monthly exposure. And there would be other people who would just hold a place in their monthly newsletter for that ad, or maybe an article. But then there are other things that are more seasonal in nature. So for example, at tax time, when people are thinking about tax-wise gifts, and at the year end, when people are also thinking about whether or not they'll be able to take their charitable deduction, there are certain kinds of seasonally appropriate communications, particularly around things like gifts of securities or gifts of stock. So think about some of those gifts on a more seasonal basis. But then the other answer to the when question is you should be promoting planned giving every time you tell a story or report on a ministry that has been funded in any way by legacy gifts. So let's say, for example, that in your newsletter, you have the opportunity now to tell a story about a missionary that you support and the particular work that they are doing, and let's just say Madagascar. And this missionary has just been home on furlough, and now you have the chance to tell a story about them, and you've been supporting this person. So absolutely, as a part of that story, you should be sure to say, and the work of Pastor Johnson is supported through this congregation's endowment fund. So every chance you get, whether it's scholarships you are giving or something internally, maybe a capital project, wherever you have legacy gifts that are supporting your ministry, and wherever you have the chance to tell a story, you always have the chance to add one sentence that says, this ministry is made possible by this fund. For more information about how you can support this work, contact this person. So weave it in, use the promotion channels you're already, leverage the promotion channels you're already using. And then every time you receive a legacy gift and you can tell the donor's story, you should. And sometimes we haven't done that in the past, and I don't think it's ever too late to pull out even an older donor's story and share it and bring it back to the fore so that people can recall the impact of these gifts. So, but when really is only going to be addressed well if you can plot your plan on a calendar or a timeline. Unless we plot it, it doesn't get done. Isn't that too often the truth? So now we're going on to how. How are we going to Are we going to make these messages possible? And here I would say again, don't reinvent any wheels. Engage the natural key stakeholders. So if there are people in your ministry organization who are already staff or volunteers for communication purposes, go to them, engage them. In fact, involve them in the planning process from the very first, because they need to have some skin in the game if this is going to impact their schedule, right? And with those people, you'll want to test and revise your plan so that, again, they have some voice. And you're going to want to assign staff and volunteers to specific tasks for implementing this. You'll want to schedule and monitor your deadlines with those staff and those stakeholders. Monitoring is big because things change, don't they? Frequently, our schedules change. And so we need to keep the staff and the stakeholders who are going to do this work in the loop whenever there are changes, so that everything moves smoothly. And again, we don't lose an opportunity to tell our story. So that is the who, what, when, where, how, why, and a bunch of checklists for you. Speaking of checklist, one of the pieces that I have that you can download from my website is a promotion planning worksheet. It just gives you the chance to kind of step through these different steps and identify the different target audiences that you want to work with, the different communication channels that you can use, the strategies that you can use. And then there's even just a grid that you can use in lieu of calendar. If you prefer a calendar, that's great, but here's a simple grid that gives you the chance to chart the who, what, where, when. And I guess I've got a couple of who's there. Oh, fascinating. I always find typos in the midst of these things, and it's a great opportunity to go back and clean up some old documents. So that's a bit about promotion planning. But before we go on to the brochure, I just want to reiterate the importance of starting simply. So you don't have to do all these things. In fact, let's go back to this promotion planning page, the what. Please, please, please don't feel like you have to do everything in the first year. If you can make a few things happen in the short term and begin to implement even 4 or 5, even 3 of these things, you're going to have more traction with your audience than you've ever had before. And so pick a few things at first, do them well so that you don't get overwhelmed. Use the resources that already exist to keep it simple. And then as you get more sophisticated with legacy giving, you can begin to add some other pieces as well. And in fact, there's so much content that's available, not only in my website as I continue to grow that, but more and more content is available from any number of vendors. I will tell you right now, to purchase some of that content is a $5,000 to $6,000 a year kind of subscription. It's one of the big reasons that I'm trying to create more content that you can download for a much lower cost, because too many organizations just don't share this important information because they don't know what to share. And it is also cost prohibitive if they go outside of their organization and go to one of these vendors to share it. So start with the simple things that don't cost you very much. And then as you get better and better and more gifts come your way, it's easier to think about making a larger investment as well. Okay, let's talk about the brochure for a minute. And that's the next piece for your promotion planning. I think a simple brochure is so important for several different reasons. And the first thing we're going to do here as we look at the brochure is ask one of my favorite questions. I'm going to ask, does your brochure pass the smell test? And a lot of people already have a brochure for plan giving. And most of the brochures that I see don't pass the smell test, at least by today's understanding of how a brochure should work. how we market and communicate to different audiences is a science and an art that keeps on changing. There's something new to learn about the most impactful way to do this every time we turn around. And so much of the way I think about a brochure now is very different from brochures that I developed even a year ago because of what we learn from readers and people who research language and all of those things. So here's the smell test that, in my opinion, your brochure needs to pass, all right? So you should be asking yourself, is your brochure more about the donor's need to give and less about your need to receive? If it's about the donor, it's going to draw them in far more quickly than if it is about your ministry organization and what you need. Donors are, especially when it comes to estate planning, do have real needs and real concerns and real issues to tend to. And there's a way of addressing that in a brochure in a way that can draw them in. So it's more about them, less about you. That's not the way we think about most of our media and communication in ministry organizations, even though our role is to be empathetic and caring about the people who are a part of our organizations. And then the second part of the smell test, does it use what Professor Russell James calls simple family words instead of a lot of formal technical words? And so if we talk about family and about how you want to impact family, instead of the very intimidating language around so many of the gift terms, that too is going to do a much better job at drawing people in. Now, much of what I'm saying about a brochure is the same thing you need to appreciate in terms of developing your website. In fact, you will use your brochure to develop your website. The content for the brochure gets you 90% of the way to where you need to be with a web page. Next part of the smell test, would the donor's professional advisor or their very protective child find it credible? And the credibility test is very important because it is true that there are plenty of nonprofit organizations that don't have staying power, that aren't able to keep their doors open, or that struggle financially. And most professional advisors and most of us who are protective children of older parents aren't going to be terribly encouraging of the person we love or our client who we care for making a gift to an organization that might not use it well, or that doesn't necessarily have a reputation for being a good steward. And so, in my opinion, the brochure can't be something you're running off of your own copy machine. I suppose there's a way, if you've got a really good printer, to do that. But for the most part, it needs to be professional enough for the advisor to look at it and say, this is a quality piece, this is filled with content that's accurate and that it is ethical, and I'm confident that this organization could take care of my client's gift. And it also needs to be something that a child would look at and say, yep, mom, dad knows who they're dealing with. And so I suggest that even though you don't want a piece that looks exorbitant in cost in any way, that your legacy giving brochure should be about the best looking piece coming out of your organization in terms of professionalism, and that to me is important if it's going to pass the credibility test. And then finally, can members of the legacy giving team actually use it as a tool for gift conversations? Now, those of us who are going to be having these conversations aren't, most of us aren't professionals in inviting planned gifts. And so if you've got a really good brochure, a good working brochure, then a volunteer, one of you, should be able to sit down with a prospective donor and actually walk through and talk through the brochure in a way that is going to help the donor understand very easily what it is you're inviting them to do. It should be a piece that gives you the confidence in telling the story. So check it out. Does it pass the smell test? If it doesn't, time to ramp it up. And then I want to introduce you, if I haven't already, to a guy that much of the world knows now by the name of Donald Miller. He is the founder of StoryBrand. He is one of the most highly followed marketing and communications experts in the country right now. And you can find his web material and his videos and information on him probably just by clicking into your Facebook page. But Donald Miller also is a man with a great faith story. Maybe you know his name if you read the book Blue Like Jazz. And if you haven't, I highly recommend it. And so he has got and has developed something called the StoryBrand framework. And the reason I'm quickly sharing this with you is because I'm also working with an associate, a colleague, who is one of only 2 certified StoryBrand experts and specialists here in Minnesota. And she is working with me on developing a basic brochure and some basic web content that we will be able to share with our mutual clients that is really focusing on this StoryBrand framework. And so I would ask the question, does your brochure tell a story, and does it do that using minimal content? And here's kind of the story order that I've lined up here for you. And the story, again, doesn't begin with your ministry organization. It begins with the donor and their wants and their needs and even their problems that they face in being faithful stewards of their accumulated assets. Believe it or not, you can address that in 2 or 3 sentences. And then the next part of the story then is your ability to guide and help them with both empathy and with authority in helping them establish a legacy gift. The next part of the storybook framework is to then identify 3 or 4 steps that your donor can take that will lead them toward a legacy gift plan and putting that in place. There's a call to action that invites them to consider one of or more of the 3 basic types of plan giving arrangements. And if you recall, instead of using fancy terms, we talk about giving now, giving later, or giving and getting. So we address that in simple language in the brochure, not in complicated language. And then we move to identifying some positive impact that this gift is going to have on the future of your ministry. We wrap up by telling people where they can go to get more information. We provide the contact information. And then also we include a couple of disclaimers that I'm going to share with you that become increasingly important. And I think in any good legacy giving brochure, there should also be a response form. So that will make your work as a legacy giving team easier if it gets in the hands of somebody who's already put a plan in place and now they can use that form to tell you. So again, as you're thinking about the brochure you already have that you're going to update or the brochure that you want to develop, think about that StoryBrand framework. Casey and I are going to be coming out with something within the month that we will make available to people in terms of a great template that can be personalized for organizations around this StoryBrand framework. So watch for that. And then the final piece of promotion planning is just using the content on your website and in other channels. And we're just going to look at a few content pieces. Again, there would be so many possibilities, but we're going to keep it simple when we start, right? And as I mentioned, the great news is that if you do really good work on your brochure, that's basically what you need for a web page. And I'm saying a web page because I think if you're just starting in this work, you don't need a full website. So once that web page is working well for you, then you might be able to move on to subsequent mastery steps where you could expand your website a bit. But even that is going to be made very simple. Some of you have probably spent time in the plan giving websites of major institutions. And so many of the major institutions subscribe to typically one of three different companies who provide prepackaged web content. And I encourage you sometime to go to one of your favorite institutions and look for their plan giving pages and to see all of this content that is available. And at first you will be wowed and you'll say, cool. And then you'll say, why does any organization need all of this on their website? It's beyond confusing and overwhelming and intimidating in my experience. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm encouraging you to keep it really simple. Also, by the way, if you're going to subscribe to any of those kinds of prepackaged programs, that too is an $8,000 to $10,000. Well, the last time I bought one, which was several years ago, $8,000 to $10,000 kind of investment. And so you really have to ask yourself if all of that is necessary, when with a few basic kinds of pieces of content, you'll be able to address the needs of most of your donors. Let's just take a look at a little more content here. And I mentioned this Have You Remembered ad. And this is an ad that, again, any number of years ago when some market research was done, it was this kind of ad that was identified as being the #1 reason why donors included their a ministry organization in their plan, or any nonprofit organization in their plan. And I want to tell you a quick story about how this worked in only one situation for me, and it's worked in many. But it was probably 10 years ago that I received a call from a woman who was a stranger to me. She introduced herself to me and she said, Brenda, I have read about you and I've had your name and your phone number from this little ad that they have done in my church newsletter now for several years. I've seen it every month in my newsletter, same place, same spot, same language. It's been reminding me every month that I need to be in touch with you or with somebody who can help me with my estate plans. And then she went on to say, I'm calling you today because last week I received a terminal cancer diagnosis and I would really like your help in putting my plans together as quickly as possible. And I've got high charitable intent. This is what I'd like to do. That's kind of an extreme example of what ended up being a beautiful gift, and talk about for me, a marvelous personal journey with an incredibly faithful woman who had no fear of what was in front of her and took all kinds of joy in putting together an incredible gift plan that benefited her 2 children and her husband and about 4 of her favorite ministries. So you never know when this reminder is going to be at the front of a person's mind when there is what I've called before a triggering event. Unfortunately, something like a health diagnosis or a scare is a triggering event, and there are many others. So that's why it's really important for something like this to have a regular presence. And again, it's effective and impactful. And then another one of the things that I mentioned earlier on was how easy it is to be able to just drop in like a sidebar kind of an article that you can use in a newsletter, or something that you can send out in an email, again, at a time, a good season. This is just an example of something that I used several years ago that it was used in a newsletter, and it was included in a church email to the entire congregation that talked about the opportunity to share a qualified charitable distribution. Easy language and easy to replicate. In fact, year after year after year, you could probably use the same thing at the same time. And again, it would be a really good reminder to people that they can use, at least in this situation, their IRA. And then I just want to also share more about the power of donor stories. Again, unless you're a seasoned story writer, sometimes these aren't so easy to tell. And I don't have the whole story here, but I do have this story on my website. And this is one that was written recently about a couple of missionaries who are recently deceased who had a commitment to this particular ministry and supported it throughout their lives with both their time and with their resources and their money. And at the end of their lives made a marvelous gift. And it's the story of so many people who follow this particular organization, Global Health Ministries. And so I share this as an example, truly, of the stories of impact, the donor stories that talk about the impact of ministry and actually connect a gift plan to real people. Those are that's really the best promotion that you can do, because people see themselves in the experiences of others. And especially when we use, again, family language that feels like something we would talk about in our living room, that makes all of the difference. And hopefully when you read some of these sample stories, you'll see that and begin to see how they're built and developed. So as you learn about that, you can write more of them yourselves as you have gifts and donors that you can talk about. So just a couple of things to remember to include in your messaging. And these are things that people forget. If they forget to always include something, usually there's a brief, like a one sentence description of your purpose that you can use in almost any situation. There'll be reasons to write a whole paragraph somewhere about why you exist as a legacy planning group and what you fund through your legacy gifts. But there also needs to be just kind of a one sentence description that you can use pretty consistently throughout all of your messaging. People also forget to use contact information and to make sure that there's always a name and a phone number and a web address and all of the information people would need in order to reach out for additional information. So always check your communications to be sure that that is included. Make no assumptions that people know to call the church office or to call the main desk at your ministry. Also, there will be times when it's appropriate for you to include some sort of confidentiality statement. And whether that's confidentiality about the information that you might get, or confidentiality about the conversations you might have, or it's important on occasion to be able to use a statement about confidentiality. And then especially as you start talking about different types of gift instruments, and I don't even like using that word because it infers, again, all of the technicalities. But if there's anything that could be misinterpreted as advice, it's really important to include this little legal disclaimer. So for example, anytime I do a presentation, even if it's an attorney doing a presentation and not giving specific advice to a specific person, we need to be able to say this information is not legal or tax advice, and please go see your advisor. It's important to tell people that the advisor is the first call for getting the real advice that they need, that we can't offer that to them. It's really not our place. We're going to go ahead to step 2 and spend a few minutes talking about professional advisors. And when we talk about professional advisors, let's first be clear about who we're talking about. So for the most part, we're talking about estate planning attorneys, sometimes other attorneys with other areas of expertise as well. But for the most part, we want to encourage people to seek attorneys who really do have good estate planning knowledge, and it's a significant part of their practice. We're talking about people who are financial planners. And when we talk about financial planners, ideally it would be people who are engaged in a broad range of financial planning instruments and tools, not people who might be pigeonholed only in, let's say, the life insurance or some other sort of insurance arena, but people who really do have the capacity to deal with their clients on virtually every financial planning kind of issue. We're talking about people who are wealth managers. So this might be somebody like my sister, for example, who is in the wealth management and trust department with a particular bank. And it's in her capacity then, in capacities like that, where she would be advising many people on issues that kind of intersect between financial management and also some legal and estate kinds of issues. And then also tax accountants become really important advisors. And I would say even more so now as people have more questions about the more recent changes in the tax law and what those changes have done for charitable giving and what kind of impact that will have on all kinds of gifts. So that's who I'm talking about when I'm talking about professional advisors. These are the professional advisors who spend time with our donors face to face and who have the ability to invite and close gifts. They can be the rainmakers. So go back to my pie from the very beginning and remember that only half of the gifts are gifts we'll know about. And even with the gifts that we know about, many more of them are being finalized at the desk of the attorney or the financial planner or others that are being finalized with the help of somebody like a charitable gift planner. So we need these advisors in our arena. We need them to be our good friends and our colleagues. And I know that we've all had experiences with different kinds of professional advisors whose incentives or whose purpose we might question a bit. But I will tell you that especially in the life of the church, especially if we look to the people who are in our pews or supporting our ministry organizations, the people who are in these professions are just as likely to see their work as a calling as any of the rest of us. I don't think we should doubt for a minute, but that they're in this work for reasons that are much bigger than what it means to bring home an income. And so many of these people have a huge desire to serve their customers and their communities and their churches. And so when we invite them into this charitable work, it helps to satisfy a need that they have to have an impact on the world as well. And so we're going to look for a minute at really just three things, all of them quick, in terms of how we introduce professional advisors to this work of legacy giving. A lot of times this work happens a little further down the pike. I think it's good for us to go to our professional advisors once we've got more of our ducks in a row. But I want to put it on the agenda for this series of webinars instead of a future series around mastery, because the sooner we have these people promoting the fund on our behalf, then the more traction we can get with the work that we're doing. So let's take a look first at what I call the win-win-win that happens when professional advisors work with us. Let's talk about motivations and what inspires them to do this work, and what it also means for the donors that we work with, and ultimately what it means for us. So for the advisors who will include charitable gift work in their practices, I know that they provide more value to their clients who want to be able to support ministry, because very few of the advisors out there do this work and do it well. And so I know people who are very charitable who look specifically for financial planners who will support them in their charitable intentions. Also, when an advisor can reduce taxes and increase the wealth of their clients by using charitable giving techniques, they hit more home runs with clients than advisors who don't. It really increases their value when they can do that work. And then the other thing advisors get to do by being engaged in charitable planning is to feel that they play a role in supporting these ministries and in communities through the gifts that they help to establish. I know that's the way I feel as a charitable gift planner, that I've had the opportunity to help donors do what they want to do, but also participate in some way, shape, or form with God's work all over the world. It's really exciting to think about how all of that gift work is impacting ministry. Excuse me. And then finally, advisors also, one of the ways that advisors earn their keep is by being able to retain some assets under management, at least many of them, not all of them, many of them. Obviously attorneys don't and accountants don't, but those who are in the wealth management, financial planning business, they do like to be able to retain assets under management. And the concern for them is the death of a particular client and what that means. They would sure prefer to be able to keep family wealth in their personal and professional pipeline for as long as they can. At least this is what professional advisors are willing to admit to me, and I don't blame them. And so one of the ways that they also win in this situation is to help their clients and their clients' families really experience the joy of their generosity, and to accompany not just the donors, but the donors' families as well, in such a way that that next generation is far more inclined to maintain that relationship with that planner. There's a lot of evidence that that most of us, after the death of a parent, who we may have been working with a parent's advisor in some of their estate planning, but will pretty quickly put our resources in another direction with a different investor after that transition. And so it really is in the advisor's best interest to serve not just the client, but the whole family, and to help the family experience some of the joy of this generosity. For donors, it's no surprise they need to have advisors working with them, because they've got some comprehensive goals that they need to meet that we just can't address in the work of the church and the work of ministry. We're not in a position to be able to give them comprehensive advice. We may have some ideas, but they need to be able to work with somebody who can see all of their goals for family and finances and charitable giving, and to address those comprehensively. Donors also like it when the taxes are reduced and they have increased wealth because of charitable giving techniques. And those advantages are real, and they have the ability to not only benefit the donor and charity, but the donor's family as well. And then, of course, they want to support the ministries they care about with these gifts, and they want to be able to connect their family to their values and not just their valuables, as a good friend of mine talks about as she refers to how wealth can impact ministry and families. And then for ministries, the win for us is that we know that our donors are receiving advice that we just aren't qualified to provide. And so that should be reassuring to us. We know that if the professional advisors are working with our donors, that we can expect to see an increased number and increased amounts of gifts. And we also know that we can accomplish more ministry as we have those additional gifts. So if we're really thinking long-term about the impact of ministry, you bet we want professional advisors working with our donors and working on our behalf. And then as we have satisfied donors and we have satisfied advisors, that word gets out there, and they will speak well of our ministries, and they will speak well to others who we hope then will also want to support ministry. All it takes is for somebody around that coffee table after church on Sunday to feel comfortable enough to say, you know, Bob and I just finished going through this process. It took so much time and focus for us, but boy, was that worthwhile to work with attorney A, B, and C over here, who was able to help us make some wonderful decisions and help us make a wonderful gift for the church. And boy, if you haven't done your estate planning yet, go to attorney ABC over here. So that word of mouth makes a huge difference. I share all of those things with you because how we understand the win-win-win, I think, inspires us to actually get active with our professional advisors. And let's take a look at how we do that. Just 3 simple steps that you can move forward with in terms of to engage and introduce your professional advisors to your legacy giving program. And the first is to simply identify the advisors who are working with your donors, and not just your donors, but your leaders. Just ask them, email the people, ask yourselves around the table, who have you worked with? Who do you recommend? Maybe it's the parents that have worked with somebody that they highly recommend. Maybe it's your church council or your board or other leaders who can give you some advice about who they use and trust. Just ask around. And while you're asking around, then also ask gift planners from other ministries or from community foundations who you trust to tell you who they use, because anybody who's doing gift planning day in and day out clearly has a set of maybe a handful of attorneys and accountants who they trust with a donor who has charitable intent. There are advisors out there who don't understand charitable giving and who don't support people with charitable intent. And I'd like to think they're few and far between, but that's why it's important to ask other people who are in the plan giving world. They will tell you who they can trust with their folks, and you want to have those people on your list as well. And speaking of list, then assemble a list of all of these people, and maybe it won't be that many. Maybe you'll come up with a list of 10 different local advisors who you would have on this list. But once you have a list, then move on to this next step and set apart an opportunity to introduce them to your ministry. To me, the perfect way to gather what could be largely strangers around a table is over a meal, because there's nothing like meal fellowship to kind of create commonalities and bring you together around a particular subject. So invite those people to a meal. It's a simple email, and give them plenty of advance notice. Maybe you want to run a few dates past these folks in order to get them all together at one time. But invite them to join you and a few members of your legacy giving group together over a meal. I'd say definitely include your chief executive officer or your lead pastor, whoever your primary spokesperson for your ministry is. They should absolutely be a part of this conversation. And then as a part of that meal, you want to introduce them to your ministry, and you do want to talk about why the partnership between advisors and donors and ministry is a win-win-win. Sometimes advisors haven't thought through the possibility. In fact, I had this conversation just a few months ago when I was trying to get some advisors around a table. And one of them in particular said to me, Brenda, I want to do this work. I know there must be something in it for me other than doing something special for my clients, but I haven't stopped to get my head around it. I haven't really thought about the value I could bring to my congregation by caring more and learning more about this work. And so there's some education that needs to happen for some of these advisors. And if you can bring them together and help them think about why this work with you and their clients and your donors matter, I think you're giving them a real gift. And then for those who can't be around that meal together, then go see them personally, meet them for coffee or go to their office and get to know them and try to appreciate what kind of a practice they have and the kind of work that they do. And in every instance, I would just ask people, are you comfortable including charitable giving in your work with some of our people if we refer them to you? And if they say yes, then ask if you can include them on your referral list. And you need to be able to develop a list that you can share with people. There's no great way of vetting all of these people until folks try them and use them and engage them, and you have the chance to work on a few gifts with them. And there could be a learning curve for some of the advisors, or if you've got the right advisors, they could become your teacher. And so that would be a goal in my mind, to find really competent professional advisors who have some great experience in charitable gift planning, whether that's an attorney who has written charitable trusts, whether it is a financial planner who has simply helped people include ministry as a beneficiary on an IRA or some insurance, It doesn't have to be people who have all of the right charitable planning credentials, but if they've done some of the work, they may be your teacher, and they may have access to resources that you wouldn't otherwise have. And then finally, with professional advisors, then make sure that you stay in touch. Make sure you provide some occasional communication and some referrals as those opportunities come up. Make sure they have some of your brochures. Ask if you can send them or put them on your email lists and their newsletter lists, because you want them to keep up with what's going on in your ministry. As you uncover charitable gift planning information that you think would be useful to them, if it's a good article or some link that you find through my website or some other resource, pass that along to your advisors so that you signal to them, we're really eager for you to learn with us so that we can be helpful together with your clients and our donors. If you're doing a seminar, invite them to attend. Some of these advisors will even be able to present seminars for you. I know that it's really difficult for people in the financial services industry to do any of this presentation work anymore because they are so bound by so many compliance hoops that unless there's a ready-made presentation that has passed the seal of approval by the company that they work for, financial planners have a difficult time actually doing presentations. But attorneys are happy to do presentations for sure. There are some accountants that would be particularly useful if they've done charitable work. At least invite them to the seminar so they meet people and rub shoulders and connect with some of your members and your donors. And then to be sure to refer them as it's appropriate. I always refer at least 2, if not 3, professionals to a donor. I don't like to have a preferred and single person that I work with. I think that's an important choice for your donor to make. So if you can have at least 2 or 3 of each type of these professionals on your professional advisor list, that's going to be the better gift. We're going to wrap up in a few minutes, but not until I share some things to avoid, some pitfalls. And since we're in Minnesota and it's road construction season, I thought this picture of a big old pothole was a really good illustration of things we're trying to avoid here, right? So the first thing we want to avoid is certain kinds of language. And again, I go back to my friend Russell James, who has done this great research on words that work. And we've always known that people don't like to talk about death, right? We get that. In fact, I think people think I'm odd that I am perhaps as comfortable talking about death as I am. But while death is an implicit part of the legacy giving conversation, and even though as people of faith, we're not afraid of death. We might be afraid of the dying process. That's something most of us don't want to go through. But we're not really afraid of, in fact, we're not afraid at all of our eternal life. We look for and long for that day. But still, we're not really comfortable talking about death. And we want to be sensitive to that. And we want to be able to position legacy giving and that decision as a life-giving, joy-filled decision. And so the words that we choose that kind of steer us away from death themes and into abundant life themes, those are really important things to be aware of. And so we might casually talk about death without any problem, but how we weave it into our messaging needs to be really very different. And so as much as you can avoid talking about death directly, that's a good call. And again, if you want to learn more about words that work, that's a link that I have on my website to some of Russell James's work. It's just phenomenal. And speaking of words that work, again, avoid at all costs all of these intimidating terms and concepts and all of the things that are filled with complexity, because these things scare off even people who are confident and competent about what they all mean. And so avoid this kind of terminology, the technical terminology. I talked earlier about family words and what those kinds of words are that you would use around the dinner table or in the living room. And so you would talk instead about getting an income from a gift, and you wouldn't talk about a charitable gift annuity. You would talk about a gift that gave you an income. That's a much more palatable kind of thing. So avoid all the terminology. And then I'm going to torture you one more time with my pie. But this time to say, avoid the temptation or the pitfall of cutting back on your messaging. This again is a mistake that too many of us make when the time gets short or the resources get tight or other things seem to become more urgent. We have to resist the temptation of cutting back on regular, consistent messaging. Don't want to do that. That consistent presence is huge. So just a few words of advice, pitfalls to avoid. Just a quick review. We've talked about promotion planning. We've talked about the importance of introducing your professional advisors. This is a good time to start typing in your questions because I'm just going to leave you with one more thought. Here we've got a picture of our little proclaimer. We want to start getting ourselves in the mindset again that this work that we do communicating is more than just making sure that we've got messages going to right audiences. At the end of the day, it's about everything we do to inspire and encourage people to do something significant for ministry that's a part of passing the faith on to future generations, right? I hope you see your work in that context. So what's my challenge to you? I'd say today, tomorrow, download the promotion planning tools, because now you've got a bunch of ideas floating around in your head that you may not have had before. Some ideas that you want to be sure you don't lose sight of, and get to work on developing your promotion plan right away. I'd say as you're developing your plan, be most cognizant of planting a place, marking a place for those things that are easy and can be used over and over again. And if you want to try a few things that are a little bit more challenging, that's fine. But don't knock yourself out this first time in terms of developing your promotion plan, but start working on it next week. And then next month, I would say that would be a perfect time to start running that Have You Remembered ad, or to pick one other thing that you begin to do even a month from now to begin to get some traction. That's my encouragement to you. Any questions that anyone has? And you know how you can reach me so that we can discuss any other questions that you do have. I am going to simply say thank you and turn off the recording and answer one particular question I see in a minute. So my encouragement is to go tell the good news about legacy giving and the impact that your ministry can have on the world, and be a proclaimer. Next month, it's about you and about the last step in legacy giving, and we'll see you then. Blessings. Okay, Danae, can you still hear me? I think the recording's still on, but I'm going to answer you. Maybe not. Okay. You asked about my shoulder. Thank you. I am doing a lot better, and they're working me hard at physical therapy, and I can do this now, and I can do this. I can do this. Don't laugh at me. I'm feeling so much better. Thanks for asking. And we'll be in touch because I think we need to confirm then early June meeting when all of us are going to be looking at lists. We're going to be looking at names for the event, and we're going to, and for invitations or the survey letter, excuse me, that's what we're going to be working on. So Danae, we can talk about that. I got family walking in the door. Before they make too much noise, I'm going to sign off. So blessings, friends. Thanks for being a part of this. And you have rain and thunderstorms on the way. So that's your warning. They've passed me. Bye.